I'm Nathan and welcome to Stories with a Twang. Today's episode is called I Have Seen Giants, They Roam Among Us by Deliriations. I am a mythologist. It was a profession passed down from generation to generation, and I've always been interested in it. The old tales my dad used to tell me about fairies, cyclops, and big giant wolves always had me on edge. There was something he never spoke about, however. That was giants. Whenever I brought up the subject of giants, he would clearly change from cheerful to stone cold, even fearful at times. One night, my dad came home drunk. I could smell the whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away. He was clearly in a state of panic, as the only detail I remember vividly were his big eyes. They were almost black. When it was time for me to sleep, I asked him for some tales, and no matter how mad he was, he always told me something I had never heard of. I miss those times. He was telling me a story about an ancient fairy garden that produces dreams when I brought up giants. Without a single word, he switched out the lights and left my room, leaving me to soak in the eeriness of if he was mad or not. When Dad left, I was around 16. One day, he left for a journey to Ireland because they found evidence of something. I don't know exactly what it was, but his note suggested it was something to do with angels. There were very detailed illustrations of them and how they looked, and it was completely different to what I could have expected an angel to look like. It had more than 2 legs, wings were small like a baby bird, but the most striking detail was the eyes. They had the same big black eyes like the night my father had when he was drunk. I crunched out the memory for the trauma it gave me. I felt uncomfortable looking at it. When I got out of college, I had a degree in mythology. I had a few friends who were interested, but most either became something else or a partner field like archaeology. One night I got a call from one of those friends. I'll call him Troy. He was clearly frantic, as if he was in a hurry, and asked me for help. Apparently, on one of the digs, they had found evidence of something that needed to be identified. My first and most obvious question was, why would you need a mythologist for that? He avoided it and said they could fly me out tomorrow. It was in Afghanistan, but it was in a more isolated area, so I wasn't too fearful of potential threats. After some time of thinking, I agreed, and I was flown out no less than when the sun had fully risen. When I stepped onto the dry, sandy landscape of the country, I was shocked. The sun was blazing so hot it felt like I would be reduced to ash. I felt uncomfortable, and I moved to the spot where I was meant to be picked up. When the pickup arrived, I hopped in, and after a few hours of treacherous heat and sandy roads, we finally arrived at a very large dig site. There were scientists, journalists, but most confusing of all, there were armed guards. As I shuffled over, Troy greeted me with a tight hug and gestured for me to follow him, and so I did. We walked into one of the many research tents, and there were very old illustrations, books, and more. But the one thing that caught my eye was a bottle that was waxed shut with a rolled up piece of paper. I looked at it, and he caught my gaze and explained, We found this at the site. We think it might be a codex or a dating. If we are right and are able to figure out what it says, it could change quite a lot about the history of this place. All the things we wondered could now be proven. Then I asked the burning question, why do you need me then? A massive lump formed in his throat as he walked out, me trailing behind. When we arrived at the main attraction, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. In this big rectangular hole stood a skeleton. This skeleton was no more than 12 feet tall and was almost 5 feet wide. I almost thought this was a joke or an animal till I saw the very clear blue oxidized copper spear and massive iron brace in with the skeleton. Then the memories flashed of my father's avoidance of giants. As a mythologist, you don't actually think any of this is possible. It's mostly cultural study. By the time I had looked at this thing long enough, it was very dark, around 11 p.m. So we all headed to bed. The only thing I remember thinking was, is this real? Have we found evidence of giants? And so I passed out in my own pool of thoughts. When I awoke, I heard lots of scampering, chatting, and most confusingly, the sound of guns being loaded. I sprung out of bed, rushing to see that the skeleton had disappeared. But even worse, so had Troy. He was absolutely nowhere to be seen. I heard people talking, but I saw a crowd up ahead, and so I followed. When I stood to see what they saw, I was shocked. There were massive trails of clear drag marks, but also there were footprints, at least 4 feet in length. The drag marks led into a valley of mounds, and so we planned to follow them. Our main thought was that Troy had taken the body and planned to sell it. When I went into his tent, everything was clearly frantically thrown around as if he had scrambled to get out of bed quickly, but also the bottle with the message was gone. I ran out and went with the group. Following the trails, I started to become anxious, fearful even. Something about this wasn't right. How could he have moved that massive skeleton out of that pit and not have made any noise, nevertheless the weight? The spear and the brace were also gone. How is any of this possible? When the trail started to shift, it went up a ramp-like slope into the top portion of these mounds. They were around 100 to 500 meters tall. When we followed them, we arrived at a cave, and without any hesitation, the group shuffled in. I stood there in shock, but before I could think, my legs did for me and I moved in. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was rancid, worse than death. But the second thing was the darkness. I had a torch with me, but before I lit it, I felt helpless. If I got lost in here without a torch, I would never make it out. I would be forced to die slowly, constricted by only the boundaries of rock walls. When I lit the room, I saw the group was a bit ahead, and so I jogged to catch up. When I hit a loose rock and it bounced into the wall, it made a loud echo. Then we heard it. Loud, heavy footsteps came from the cave right in front of the group. The first thought was a wild animal, and so a lot of us rushed out. When we made it out, we heard yelling and screaming, then the noise started to muffle till it all stopped. We heard crunching, then slurping, the sound of a predator feeding on its prey. One of the very many armed guards quickly loaded his rifle and the sound stopped. The footsteps slowly this time came toward us, and the guards immediately put their weapons up waiting. A massive shape of a human came from the darkness. From even that, I could tell it was around 15 feet, maybe even more. Then it emerged. From that cave, a massive axe swung out, striking one of the guards in the body and sending him off the mountain. There were no screams. He was dead instantly. The figure emerged, and from what I saw will be engraved in my memory like a message. It stood tall, its skin was a pale, stark gray, and its features were strict. It had black, deep eyes sunken into its head far more than naturally should. Its nose was slightly cut off, and it had horrendous scars on its face. But its mouth is what I remember the most. It had a grin with thousands of tiny, razor-sharp teeth, and there was blood on them. It was primal, a supernatural being that should not have existed. It wore bones with rags on it, and it had a brace. It was wearing the body of what we dug up, like a trophy. But the final thing that haunts me was what hung off its body. There were twine ropes with body parts mounted on them like trophies. I figured they were Troy's. The guards opened fire on the beast as it let out a deep, guttural roar, almost like the screech of metal. I watched as it grabbed the closest person, one of the guards, and without any trouble, the beast squeezed. The guard turned to nothing more than a red paste, and it dripped out of the thing's knuckles. That's when I ran between its feet and into its lair. I ran and ran until I found where it had been hiding. There was a small cavern, and there stood a bunch of dead grass, sticks, and other things. I don't know how this thing got grass in the middle of Afghanistan, but I didn't care. As I ran up to it, I saw the message and I approached it. The bottle was easy to break, and I thought in my last moments I would read it. This is what I read. To all who find this, I am dead. I am not the body of the monster that has been found. I am rather the man by the name of Lucas Hitchwood. What you have dug up is a giant, a massive beast that resides in all places but is mostly known as fantasy. Lucas Hitchwood was my father's name. The note was in smeared ink and was clearly written in a hurry. I looked at the bottle and noticed something. It was an old whiskey bottle. Everything finally clicked. He had never went to Ireland. He came here. He knew they existed. As I thought this, more gunshots echoed and screams emanated from the pitch dark. My torch couldn't illuminate. In a hurry, I ran to a wall and I saw something shiny. There was a watch, a silver watch, which I recognized. It was my father's. I saw bones scattered and I realized he had died here. I sobbed like a baby till the shot stopped. I thought it was coming back, then I heard my name being called. I rushed out to see the beast had fallen, dead. Its eyes lay open to reveal the same dark, sunken voids I had seen moments ago. That was the last thing I remembered, the black voids of that thing's eyes. Then I passed out. I awoke in hospital and was told I had suffered from intense stress, which caused the fainting. As the nurse walked out, 2 men in suits walked in. I had heard of this, the men in black. What you saw that day is something that very few have ever seen. We have contacted who you work for and have managed to get you a sum of money in exchange for sworn secrecy. A contract will be provided for this soon. I was paid $300,000 to be quiet about the horrors I witnessed that day. Now when I walk around the streets, I notice more black eyes staring at me. It's not long before I joined my dad. The stress has been too much. I'm considering just taking a shitload of pills and dozing off in peace. Be warned of the giants. They exist and they walk in plain sight. Alright everyone, I hope you all really enjoyed this week's story. I would like to give a giant thank you to this week's author, Deliriations, for letting me read their story on the show. If you have any stories you would like me to read on the show, you can send them over to storieswithatwang@gmail.com. The show is on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Stories with a Twang Podcast. It would mean an awful lot if you could rate and review the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to share with your friends and family as well. It could really help the podcast grow. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and until next time, remember that a little twang goes a long way.